I gotta say, this is awful that Diddy owes his life to Mark Agnifilo, literally his life, because he could have gotten life in prison were it not for Mark Agnifilo.
Diddy is officially in panic mode right now. And this time it's not internet talk or random rumors, it's real pressure coming straight from the legal side, and that's what makes it terrifying. When your own lawyer walks away, not because of money, not because of scheduling issues, but because the cases are too dark to defend, that sends a message louder than any headline ever could. Insiders say this wasn't some calm exit either. It was sudden, tense, and filled with uncomfortable conversations that pushed things past the point of no return. People close to the situation claim the lawyer saw evidence piling up, allegations stacking on top of each other, and legal risks growing so heavy that staying on would have meant sinking with the ship. Behind closed doors, the mood around Diddy has completely shifted, and the confidence he once moved with is gone.
His defense lawyer, who had a brilliant strategy, and Diddy screwed him over when he hired this videographer to chronicle his life without telling Mark Agnifilo that when Diddy and Mark were on the phone, this videographer was recording what Mark clearly expected to be an attorney-client privileged relationship. Now, it is true that the client holds that privilege, the lawyer doesn't, but Mark's clear expectation was that this was a private conversation. These were private conversations, and that he and Diddy could talk openly, and Mark could talk to Diddy not just as a client, but as a person, and try to guide him in a time leading up to his arrest. And unbeknownst to Mark Agnifilo, Diddy has got this guy recording the conversation as he's sitting there saying, "You are screwing this up. You are messing up this case. We're losing." And knowing that that's on tape. And it's almost like he's performing for the camera and not telling Mark what's going on. And the really enraging part about it is that Mark Agnifilo won this case for Diddy with legal strategy. It wasn't just an accident that this jury that had heard all of this in the news before the trial voted not guilty on all the serious charges. It was Mark Agnifilo that did that. Yet Diddy secretly records this guy and embarrasses him. And yeah, you could say, well, Diddy never expected that it would end up being broadcast somewhere else. Well, okay, but Diddy was planning on using it, or he wouldn't have had it recorded in the first place. So it's just really, really unfair. And I know that in a way this sounds crazy, that I'm getting so upset about Diddy, and yet there's video of Diddy beating Cassie. Well, that's horrendous, but that doesn't mean you can't look at something else as well. And I just think, as a lawyer, I just think this is just so outrageous that he would do something like this, and not even understanding what Agnifilo's legal theory was. Because I will tell you that when we did our first documentary on Diddy, which was 8 months before the trial, Mark Agnifilo said to me on camera that he is going to tell this jury that this was a successful black man that prosecutors were trying to take down because they couldn't get into his bank accounts because they were clean, and he couldn't deal with they couldn't deal with taxes because he wasn't committing tax fraud. So they go into his bedroom. And that's what Mark Agnifilo said 8 months before. And he goes into the trial and he essentially wins that argument. Whether you believe it or not, a jury that sat through the whole thing, they believed it. And ultimately they convicted him on this BS Mann Act thing. So Diddy won that case. And one of the reasons he won the case is something that Agnifilo got criticized for. That when he did the documentary with me, he was making a joke about the baby oil. Remember, he said, "Oh, well, I didn't know he bought in bulk. He must have bought 1,000 bottles at Costco." And a lot of people just slammed him for that and said, how dare.
Sources say his inner circle is shrinking by the day, phones are ringing less, and meetings that used to feel powerful now feel desperate. The lawyer dropping him wasn't just a legal move, it was a signal to the industry that this situation is spinning out of control. When a legal professional decides walking away is safer than staying, it tells you everything about how serious these investigations have become. What really shook people is the reason being whispered behind the scenes. According to insiders, the cases didn't just grow complicated. They grew disturbing, layered, and risky in ways that couldn't be ignored anymore. Allegations from different directions reportedly started lining up, timelines began matching, and paperwork allegedly revealed patterns that made defending impossible without crossing lines. That's when the lawyer allegedly said enough was enough, choosing reputation and legal safety over loyalty.
Risky for them to put Christina Quorum on the stand, I think.
There was so much being said about your client in that trial, obviously in the media, facing a number of different lawsuits. We also wondered whether or not he, and it's his decision alone, whether he wanted to take the stand and give his story, tell his story, give his version of events. Obviously, there are a ton of risks that come with putting a defendant on the stand, but it would be his choice. Was there a conversation about that?
Well, I mean, I can't get into, attorney-client privilege conversations. Obviously he thought about it, decided not to. And, as I indicated earlier, we thought the case had gone in really well for us. And so we liked where we were. So that was basically the decision.
Now, the big news, a lot of big news came out after the trial, was the firing of Maureen Comey, the lead prosecutor in this case. Now, there's obviously a political angle to it. There are comments that she has made, but I have to ask, you going head to head against her for so many weeks, months and before that, the firing of her, what did you make of that?
I think it was unfortunate. She's a very well-respected prosecutor. We had good sort of professional relationships with her during the course of the trial. And, I don't really think it had anything to do with the trial, but I can't really say anything beyond that. It just,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's talk about something we can get into quite a bit. Let's talk bail. Okay, so we did a previous sidebar breaking down the defense's renewed motion for release, several arguments for why Sean Combs should be released on bail pending sentencing, acquitted of the most serious charges. There's no comparable case of someone who is convicted of the Mann Act alone and not engaging in sex trafficking or a prostitution for financial gain, and they would be locked up like this. Talked about the issues plaguing the MDC, how it is dangerous, how he's not a risk of flight, not a danger to the community. But do you think Judge Arun Subramanian is going to be persuaded by your letter, by your motion? Because obviously he specifically highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent. Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. They had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off, and I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual nature of this particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been in prison, or jail rather, for like 11 months. This case.
Now Diddy is facing something he hasn't dealt with in decades, being exposed without a shield. No carefully crafted statements, no strategic delays, no legal wall to hide behind, and that's where the panic really kicks in. People say he's scrambling to find new representation, but the problem is simple. Nobody wants to touch a case this heavy, this public, and this dangerous. Law firms don't just look at money, they look at risk, optics, and long-term fallout. And right now, this case is radioactive. Industry insiders claim investigators are moving faster than ever now that cracks are showing. Once a lawyer steps away, it opens doors for deeper digging, tougher questioning, and less resistance from people who were previously silent. Allegedly, witnesses who stayed quiet out of fear are now reconsidering, feeling like the protection is gone. That shift alone could change everything. What makes this situation even more intense is how long Diddy managed to stay untouchable. For years, he was seen as powerful, protected, and always one step ahead. But power only works when people are willing to stand next to you, and right now, that support is fading fast. Industry veterans say moments like this are usually the beginning of the end because once the legal armor cracks, everything hidden underneath becomes visible. The streets are talking, the blogs are watching, and the silence from Diddy's camp is louder than ever. No bold denials, no confident appearances, no public reassurance, just tension. People who once defended him are now choosing their words carefully, stepping back, or staying completely quiet. That kind of behavior doesn't happen unless fear enters the room.
This is a one-off to begin with, but we're not aware of any case like this with a Mann Act conviction where anyone's done that much time to begin with. So.
And prosecutors, I'm imagining, have come back or will come back and say, well, listen, look, after the raids on his property, he engaged, or what they would say, he allegedly engaged in criminal activity and, obviously violence, they say, with Jane. But they say, look, what was in his hotel room when he was picked up in New York. They made allegations of what he was trying to do while he was in the MDC, whether it was using other inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls. That was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago, but how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time. And I think one of the good things and positive things is that has come out of his incarceration. It's given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just, maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance. And he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So, I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that. And I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission. And he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act conviction.
Behind the scenes, experts say this could be the most dangerous phase yet. Not because of one single allegation, but because of accumulation. When cases stack, when stories overlap, and when professionals start backing away, the legal system takes notice. And once that machine gets rolling, stopping it becomes almost impossible. Right now, Diddy isn't just fighting allegations, he's fighting momentum, and momentum is undefeated. The lawyer dropping him didn't create the storm, but it definitely confirmed it. And as investigations continue to intensify, people are starting to realize this moment could expose everything he's been trying to keep buried for years. Now the real pressure is kicking in, because once that lawyer stepped away, the whole balance flipped overnight. People close to the situation say Diddy went from calling shots to reacting to problems, and that's a dangerous switch for someone used to control. Without legal direction, every move feels shaky, every decision feels rushed, and every silence feels louder than a denial. Insiders claim he's been pacing, calling around, trying to lock down damage control, but the doors that used to swing open are suddenly locked tight. What's making this even worse is how fast the industry mood changed. Executives who once praised him are now keeping their distance, collaborations are being quietly paused, and longtime associates are allegedly reevaluating their loyalty. Nobody wants to be standing too close when things collapse, and right now, everything feels unstable. People in the know say this isn't about friendship anymore, it's about survival. Investigators, according to sources, are pressing harder now that the legal wall is gone. Subpoenas are moving faster, records are being reviewed deeper, and every old connection is being re-examined under a sharper lens. When protection disappears, truth starts surfacing in unexpected ways.
Should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we've talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. They were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitution in a lot of states doesn't include this conduct, even if someone's being paid. If the person making the payment is paying essentially to observe other people having sex, that's not prostitution. So we've got the First Amendment argument, as you mentioned, and the new trial argument. So all of those arguments, I think, are independent of, the issue you raised, which, so we think we have a really strong motion. And so we're hoping the judge will agree. We'll see.
So just to be clear, I'll list out a couple of things that stood out to me when we were watching the trial. there was apparently this voice message that was played from Combs to Paul, right, one of the purported sex workers. Hit me up when you close. There was a voice message. Hey, Jess, I need to get him from Atlanta to here. Let me know. Hit me up. There was a message from, I think, Combs to Christina Coram. Can security bring me 5,000? There was another audio message to Jane. I sent you 15K, baby girl. There was another one to Frank Rodriguez. Frank, make sure that room is set up right. So in other words, you could look at this and say, and the argument is, even despite all that, it's paying people for their time. It's setting up, let's say, amateur pornography. What makes this not, because it always seemed that those charges were relatively straightforward, transporting people for the purposes of sex work. You're saying the intent was not sex work. That just so happened, whatever happened, happened, but the intent wasn't there. Just want to clarify that point.
Yeah, so that's one of the arguments. And then the other argument is just that it's more of a pure legal argument that prostitution only includes when you're paying someone to have sex with you. And he wasn't having sex with the males. So that's kind of a totally separate thing, even if you buy the government's argument that these payments were owed.
Allegedly, details that once felt buried are now being pulled back into focus, and the picture forming is not flattering. What's wild is how the strategy seems completely lost. No unified message, no clear defense angle, just silence, mixed with tension. Legal experts say that kind of chaos sends the wrong signal. It tells authorities that there's uncertainty behind the scenes. And uncertainty invites pressure. Pressure invites mistakes. Mistakes invite consequences. People online are already speculating, but the real concern isn't social media. It's what's happening quietly, away from cameras. According to insiders, some individuals who stayed quiet out of fear are now feeling less threatened. When a lawyer walks away, it breaks the illusion of safety, and that illusion kept a lot of people silent for a long time. Once it cracks, things move fast. Another layer making this situation heavier is timing. Investigations like this don't happen in a vacuum. They build when the environment allows it. Right now, the industry is less tolerant, less forgiving, and more willing to clean house. That shift alone puts Diddy in a weaker position than ever before. What might have been brushed off years ago now gets taken seriously.
Ways for sex. And I do want to point out that there's testimony and evidence that there were a number of occasions where the guys didn't end up having sex and they still got paid for their time. There's a bunch of text messages between Sean and people who work for Cowboys for Angels, one of the escort services, where, she's making clear that they dot all their I's and cross all their T's and that this isn't sex for money. So that's kind of his mindset. And, the crime is transportation with the intent for the person being transported to engage in prostitution. So it's all sort of what's in his head and whether he's believing that he's paying, or arranging the transportation rather, in connection with prostitution. And then you get into sort of what is prostitution, and does it include, paying someone even if you're not the person who's going to have sex with them.
Let's say the motion for judgment of acquittal is not successful. Let's say the bail motion's not successful. And let's say your client is sentenced to a significant prison term, because there is discretion on the part of the judge. There's been a lot of talk in the news about this idea of a presidential pardon. Is the president really considering it? Have there been conversations with his team? Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Well, I don't really know. The trial team's not really involved in any of that. There's a lot of rumors floating around the internet and in the news media. So I can't really speak to it. It would make sense that the president, given his history, would be thinking about it for someone like Sean, but I can't really, I have no personal knowledge about that.
And if there is an unfavorable sentence, I imagine you would immediately appeal this conviction and sentence. What would be some of the arguments that would be made, if you can give us a preview, and and why you think they would be successful?
So I think Sean would almost definitely appeal if all of those things happen, which we hope won't. But it would be a lot of the same arguments that are in our post-trial motion that we've been talking about. The First Amendment, the argument about whether this actually was transportation to engage in prostitution, whether he should have in light of the acquittals, he should get it in the alternative, a new trial where none of the evidence about the violence and the alleged racketeering would come in. Those would be, the principal arguments, I would imagine.
Yeah, if they didn't have racketeering or sex trafficking, you think they would have actually prosecuted him just for Mann Act violations?
I don't think so. It certainly would have violated Justice Department policy. I mean, the Justice Department policy for the past 75 years has been generally not to prosecute people other than people who are actually running prostitution rings to make money. And then on top of that, in more recent years, the only kinds of cases they've brought have been cases where they're alleging sex trafficking or other serious crimes. And at the beginning of this case, we made a selective prosecution motion. We argued that Sean was targeted because of his race, because this, with respect to the Mann Act in particular, because this was so unique. And one of the things they came back with is they said, well, we charged him with RICO and sex trafficking, and then they pointed to other cases involving white men where they had brought these other charges as well as the Mann Act. So
I know I have to let you go. Before I do, I just want to ask you one more question because I know all of our viewers will be asking. What happened to victim 3? What happened to victim, I think, 5? There were other people that were supposed to be called by the prosecution, and there was a back and forth where the defense basically said, right, to the prosecution.
Behind closed doors, sources say emergency plans are being discussed, asset protection, reputation management, and exit strategies. That doesn't mean guilt, but it does mean fear. Powerful people don't plan escapes unless they feel cornered. And right now, the walls feel close. The silence from Diddy himself is what's bothering people the most. No direct response, no confident pushback, just distance. In moments like this, silence isn't calm, it's calculated. But calculations only work when you have time, and time doesn't seem to be on his side anymore. Industry veterans say this phase is often the tipping point. Once legal professionals step away, the dominoes start falling in places nobody expects. One case leads to another. One testimony opens doors to more questions, and suddenly the narrative is no longer controllable.
Minute break, which, by the way, our guest Serena Townsend had said, hey, listen, I was asking, does any of this affect the judge's decision? In other words, does the judge just come in there, know what he's going to do? Is he persuaded by anything that anybody says in court? It's like, well, if they take a break, they go back, they may change their sentence. 5-minute break. I was like, oh, does that mean that he changed his sentence? Comes back, delivers this sentence, and it felt a little bit like a roller coaster. You kind of got an idea of where he was going and then not. And talk to us about how he started, what he said, and what the ultimate verdict was. And then we can get into a little bit about what the impact was in court, how people reacted to it. But what did the judge say exactly regarding the sentence?
Yeah, to your point, Jesse, it really was like a roller coaster because I didn't know where he was going because he was starting by saying, I consider that you are an artist and a businessman and your work history are celebrated. And he used the words that Sean Combs' work history was also iconic. He says it's impressive given the early death of your father. Your work with inner city kids is commendable. There's no doubt that you are devoted to your family. So I think when he was saying those words, Jesse, I think he was really specifically talking about those impact letters and also seeing that 11-minute video about just all the extensive work that Sean Combs has done throughout his life outside of this federal case. And so the judge saying there's no doubt that you're devoted to your family, but the court knows that you do have problems with addiction, that drugs may have exacerbated your conduct over the years. So this was a moment where I was thinking, oh, well, maybe he'll be a little lighter on the sentence. That's what I was thinking. But then the judge said the court rejects the defense's narrative of the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that this was just comes with the lifestyle of being an artist, a musician, a producer. The judge said you abused power and control over women who loved you. You used that abuse to get away, and the evidence of abuse in connection to freak-offs and hotel nights is massive. We saw the gashes and the bruises and the broken doors, and this is specifically talking about what Cassie had gone through throughout her, Cassie and Jane in that respect, throughout their relationships with Sean Combs, and that the judge said Jane and Cassie thought about both ending their lives, that these were very serious offenses. You plied Cassie with drugs. Your conduct went over for more than a decade. You were no John, but you were just more than that. And so then the judge is telling Sean Combs, while you said you're sorry, one thing that strikes me is you brutally assaulted Jane. You punched, kicked her, slapped her so hard that she fell down. But I think when people think of this particular instance, while the defense and the government say that this was one instance of physical violence when it came to Jane specifically, I think it's notable the timing of when this had happened. This had happened in June of 2024, just last year, but also notably after Cassie's lawsuit. This was after his homes were raided. This was after the video of him assaulting Cassie had leaked to CNN. And the judge said that even after he had physically assaulted Jane during this June 2024 incident, that he had said, and this was going by the court transcript, take this effing pill. You aren't going to ruin my effing night. You asked her also, is this coercive? And so I think from the judge's perspective, that was kind of a clear sign that the conduct has still been going on just pretty quickly or pretty recently. And so the judge also said these acts of sexual violence, substantial sentence must be given. So I was thinking maybe he would agree with the prosecution, possibly go for that 135 months. But he says he said, while that's more than necessary, he said it's also not reasonable. And he said that the government's proposal doesn't take into consideration the mitigating factors, where it was the opposite for the defense, where the defense's proposal of pretty much being time.
At that stage, the story writes itself. Right now, Diddy is facing the most dangerous opponent of all, exposure. Not rumors, not talk, but structured investigations backed by evidence and momentum. The lawyer dropping him didn't end anything, it accelerated everything. And as pressure continues to mount, one thing is clear. This isn't just a scandal anymore. It's a full-blown unraveling that could change how his legacy is remembered forever.